everybody. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are very welcome to our continuing coverage of Brazil, which we're doing for this whole month. But this week specifically, we are looking at the economy in the country of Brazil on our Colonizers World Tour. If you watched our Econ 101 yesterday, whoo boy, it's complicated, but I think that's my too long didn't read about Brazil. It's really big and it's really complicated. But for today's piece of art, we are talking about the Oscar-nominated documentary, The Edge of Democracy, which was a film in 2019, came out in 2019, so it was nominated in the 2020 Academy Awards. And it is the story, it is both political documentary and personal memoir. So the narrator is a woman named Ana Petra, and her parents were both, I was like scrolling into my notes. Yes, Ana Petra. Her parents were both activists against the military dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s. And she is basically telling the story of like how Brazil got to this precipice of quasi-democratic collapse or institutional issues, especially with the last two presidents before Bolsonaro, a man with many names that they called Lula, and then followed by a woman named Dilma Rousseff. And, you know, she has this great kind of poem that she reads as a voiceover at the beginning, and she said, you know, one president impeached, another imprisoned, and a nation moving rapidly towards its authoritarian past. So, I mean, that's quite a setup to start a 2-hour documentary with. So we get the story of why one president got impeached, why another one was imprisoned, and why we get this rushing towards the authoritarian past, which includes the rise of popular support for the current president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, and it covers up to his election in October of 2016. And boy, 2016 was one heck of a year, like globally. I know you and I sat down after we watched this and we were like, how can we trace back the alchemy of 2016? So we get the backstory of Lula and Dilma and then all of the interworking politics. We have a lot to say about this. My recap isn't going to cover much more because I think we're going to get into a lot of the nitty gritty as we talk about things that we want to. But it is basically that setup piece from, and it's important to note that like there's several political parties in Brazil, but it's kind of a two-party system in that there's a right-wing conservative party and a left-wing workers party, and it's important to know that both Lula and Dilma were leaders in the Workers' Party, which came about in 1980, and Lula was one of the founders of it. As often happens, the Workers' Party came out of labor union strikes, and he was a union leader in the steelworkers strike in 1979, which then led to the creation of the Workers' Party in 1980. And then he ran for president a lot and kept losing until 2002 when he won. So that's kind of the setup. We've got this push and pull between left-leaning politics and right-leaning politics, as we often do all around the world, and as we did a lot in 2016. And as happened in other parts of the world in 2016, the right-wing faction won with Bolsonaro's election. But it's way, way more complicated than that. So we will get into what we can possibly get into with this crazy story. Like, y'all, some of the things that happened in this documentary, Dr. Kristen and I were like, what? Yeah. I mean, look it. She's got the stickers to prove this, folks. There's not a lot of all caps in my notes because I was just so furiously trying to understand what was happening. But if there were, it would just be at the beginning, like, what the hell?
I have a couple.
Yeah.
Like, one of the ones is, okay, so he was publicly guilty and your move is to make him chief of staff? That's a fucking choice.
I know.
Like, there's a couple like
Oh,
that.
yeah. I do have one where I said there is really nothing new under the sun and we are not special at all. So the at all was in all caps. Oh, no, I do. I'm sorry. So much misogyny. The fuck America. Yeah, I have some all caps. The patriarchy will always protect itself.
A legal system built on the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. Oh, it's a fascinating story. And there's a lot of gender dynamics, as there always are in politics. So yeah,
like, there's part of me that has, I have no idea how to talk about this movie.
Me neither.
Other than I want everybody to see it, because I want people to understand Bolsonaro in this context.
Yeah.
In a way that I think helps us understand, because honestly, I get that America is who exported itself the most, and so we culturally determine a lot of things around the world by American standards, but very legitimately, Brazil is one of the countries keeping us alive because of the rainforest.
Yeah.
And so it's not wise for any of us to ignore what's happening in Brazil.
Especially especially at this moment of climate crisis and what's happening in the Amazon because of the leadership of Bolsonaro. So, like, literally our lives are at stake because
our lives are at stake
of what happened in this election.
But it's very simple to ignore Brazil because it feels impenetrable.
Right.
But in 2 hours, she made it very penetrable. She
sure.
really, in a really clear way, said, here are all the factions. I appreciated that she was very, it's obviously made by somebody who supports Dilma. And Lula, her mother is like, there's an interview where they actually have like a one-on-one conversation, with Dilma Rousseff, and there's a lot of, like, she's obviously a perspective, and she's never shy about that.
Right.
And I have a lot more time for documentarians who are like, hey, up front, this is who I am. But she's also like, hey, like, a good chunk of my family voted for Bolsonaro. And I'm still wrestling with that.
Yeah.
And I can understand why they voted for him. Like, it makes sense to me. And here, let me tell you why they did.
Yeah.
And I feel similarly about some of the conversations America was unable to have after the 2016 election, where we just very quickly demonized anyone who didn't vote the way that we wanted them to.
Right.
And I remember in early 2017 looking at somebody and saying, well, I voted for Hillary, and I love a lot of people that voted for Trump. And she was like, are you still speaking to them? And I was like, I'm sorry? Of course
I love them.
You want me to stop speaking to them because they voted for the other guy? I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I heard that louder and louder and louder throughout 17 and 18, is that there was a big push in the United States to cut off anyone who voted for the person you didn't. And I'm watching, she demonstrated that was also a push in Brazil with Bolsonaro, that anyone, there became this great cultural divide. And now, I didn't understand, like, I was explaining this documentary to somebody over the weekend. I didn't understand how recent the military dictatorship was. I didn't understand how many coups they had. I definitely didn't understand the, like, fake, kind of weird aristocracy the Portuguese left for a little while. Like, even in the colonizer world tour, I didn't really grasp all of that. And it's the post-World War II Brazil and what that kind of looked like. And one of the things that came up in the next week that we do, the next time we see you guys, we're going to be talking about slavery. And one of the statements that they make as I've been researching that is that there was a flood of white folks in the 40s and 50s to bring in industrialization.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a ton of white folks before then. There was like a really, really small number. And so there has been inequity in Brazil forever.
Yeah.
And they just kept, so this is why I bring this up. So the thing that was a big thing in Brazil for a long time is this thing called racial democracy. And it was the way that they presented themselves as, hey, we're all these races and we're all unified and it's all really great. And then in the 90s and the aughts, the Workers' Party came along and they were like, actually, it's not working as well as you think it is, and here's why.
Yeah.
One of the things that Bolsonaro ran on was bringing racial democracy back. And when an entire population for about 15 years has been told that they're the problem with their country, it's very natural for that population to grab on to someone who's telling them it's not their fault.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a piece of this that up to watching this documentary, I did not understand.
Yeah, and I think I have this like giant quote in here from this book by Michael Reed on Brazil that I'm currently reading, and will be, well, as we're filming this, I'm currently reading, and it will be up on our Abby Research Reads sister channel during this month as well for me to review. But I think, like, I was reading this section about the military dictatorship right when we watched Edge of Democracy, and it really helped me understand the dictatorship, but also kind of like the why of Bolsonaro a little bit, because he is a former military leader that then
God, I always forget that.
Became a political. Because when Dilma is being impeached, in his speech, he like louds the main torturer.
I just forgot that he like worked with that guy. Yeah, like I just keep forgetting. Like he himself was a military person. I just keep forgetting that.
Yeah, because we don't often have in the United States a big crossover between like former military people becoming political leaders.
It's got to be since Eisenhower.
Like Tammy Duckworth is, and like
I'm sorry, like on a presidential level, it's got to be since Eisenhower.
Kennedy was, but
he wasn't known for being a general or anything else. So
no, I mean, he ran on the PT 109 story, but like it wasn't like, it was General Eisenhower was the big one. Yeah.
It's been a minute. You're right.
And I think Bolsonaro was a general. Like he was a big deal.
Yeah.
But for me, so this, I'll pull out bits of this quote from Michael Reed's book. But the point he makes effectively is that Brazil's military dictatorship was very different from the other ones in Latin America in the 60s and 70s because they institutionalized the military. So they made this like, they kind of maintained the facade that the government still worked, which isn't what a lot of places did. Like, that's not what happened in Argentina and Chile.
Or Chile. No, Pinochet didn't work. That's why he eventually got overthrown. Well, that and he, like, killed half his population.
Killed a lot of people.
Pinochet didn't work. Yeah.
Right. So, like he says, it manipulated elections but did not abolish them. For all except one period of almost 2 years, Congress remained open, though it was heavily purged. In this way, the armed forces sought to maintain the consent of regional elites and share the burden of government, just as the monarchy had done. The general
so it was almost the perfect transition.
Yeah. So it said, like, although the dictatorship was more repressive than the Estado Novo, which was what preceded the dictatorship, it was less so than its counterparts in Argentina and Chile. So it was fascinating to me that, like, it wasn't really a different, like, they kept a lot of the structures of the government. And so that way, like, things, if you weren't anti-dictatorship, things were okay for you. And we get some people in this documentary talking about, like, we have to go back to the military dictatorship because things were better in the military dictatorship. And there's this young guy, and he's talking about, like, his uncle or somebody who's with him, and he's like, he remembers the military dictatorship and things were good. Like, we should go back to that. And the young guy next to him is like, so you didn't have any family members killed, but like.
And I thought a lot about, like, we see this in the discourse in the 90s and even more so in the aughts in a lot of the former Soviet bloc countries where their grandparents are like, could we get communism back, please?
Yeah.
And the kids are like, I really like having my own toilet paper. What are you talking about? So, like, there's some real generational stuff when it comes. And I was telling you, I have a friend whose grandparents grew up under Franco.
Yeah.
In Italy before they emigrated. And, like, they had no problems with him for the longest time because the trains ran on time. Mussolini, sorry.
Yeah, Franco was Spain.
Sorry. Yeah. Mussolini. Like, they were like, oh, he's not a problem. The trains ran on time.
Yeah. So it was fascinating to get kind of that historical context so then, like, what they said happened after that, what Michael Reed said happened after that was that a lot of the dictatorship, the military leaders of the dictatorship were kind of folded into the government after the dictatorship fell. So there's a lot of old military folks who are still, like, now in the political elites. And so they just keep shifting the same kind of form of government, this racial democracy, through different iterations. And what we see in this is it's very gendered. And And so, you know, we were joking before, like, how do you explain the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff? Like, she was a lady.
She was a lady and the economy was bad.
And the economy was bad. Like, they end up impeaching her for, like, maybe a financial decision they didn't agree with, but it wasn't illegal. But it was clearly the proverbial witch hunt to get her out of there. And when you hear other politicians, especially those from the opposing party, interviewed in this documentary on why they wanted her out, it wasn't that she broke the law, because she didn't. It was that, well, you know, she doesn't really hug. Like, you know, we all hug each other and kiss each other. She's not a hugging type of a person.
No, she doesn't get along with anybody. Nobody likes her.
Nobody likes her. Yeah. And it's really important to note that, like, Brazil, like, one of the foundations of Brazilian government from colonization is corruption. Like, those are the two things. Like, slavery and corruption is what built Brazil and maintained Brazil. And then they abolished slavery, but they kept the corruption. And Dilma Rousseff is the first president ever to, like, set an investigation into government corruption. And as we talked about in the video yesterday or before in the playlist with the Operation Car Wash and the Petrobras scandal, she's the first president to actually say, I'm going to go after people. And when you have government corruption to institutionalized to the level of Brazil, that's a lot of people that are her colleagues, her work colleagues, that want to keep doing what they're doing. And that's what we get throughout this whole documentary, is like leaked phone calls where they're literally pushing her out because she's threatening. They are saying, you know, if she succeeds with this, I can't keep making money on the sly. So that was a huge part of it. And like, that she didn't play along with the system that they had all established. But for me, I think the fact that the military was like folded in, it's almost like folding in the cheese in my Schitt's Creek reference. Like, they were just kind of, or when on Great British Bake Off, when they make the layered butter, what's it called? I don't know, pastry, where they like layer the butter and the dough. I feel like that's what happened. It was like politics, military, corruption. Politics, military, corruption. Here's the dough of the Brazilian government. And Dilma Rousseff was like, no.
And we'll talk about this next week a little bit more. It isn't just that there was some slavery in Brazil. It isn't just that it was kind of there. 40% of the global transatlantic slave trade went to Brazil. 40%. For some perspective, approximately 5% went to the United States. So.
Yeah. It's a big thing.
So when they abolished it in 1888, which they were the last country to do, the reason the economy didn't collapse was corruption.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, like, the United States is when we abolished slavery-ish, I mean, when we transitioned slavery to legally endorsed slavery, the South economy collapsed not just because of the war.
Yeah.
Like, the Civil War is not the only reason the South industrialization, like, the South collapsed. They built everything on slavery, and when we took slavery away, they didn't know what to do.
They lost their whole workforce.
They lost their whole workforce. And so Brazil saw that, because they had a 20-year, jump on us in terms of, like, length. And they were like, oh, we had a 20-year jump on them. And they were like, oh, I don't want that. Yeah. So let's still make everything state-owned and make it easy to run through bribes.
Yeah.
And so it's not slavery. Like, they don't have a 13th Amendment where you can still legally enslave people and call it prison.
Right.
The way that we have it here. I would argue that their prisons are probably that. But they don't, from everything I've read about Brazilian incarceration, it doesn't sound great. And there's a lot of police brutality and a lot of similar problems down there that, again, we just don't hear about because Brazil feels foreign and impenetrable.
Right.
So if we could give you any gift this month, it would be, please don't let it still be impenetrable. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. There's quite a lot of parallels. There's quite a lot of things that you can say, okay, that looks familiar enough. Now let me contextualize it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things is their reaction to the abolition of slavery, in that they just institutionalized corruption.
Yeah.
And we institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
In a different way. So, like, that's one of the reasons that they have an easier time talking about racism than we do, and we have an easier time talking about corruption. Because in terms of, like, the original sin, they adopted corruption as theirs, and we adopted racism as ours.
Oh, that's such a great point. And I was just, as you were talking about that and describing that, thinking through, like, you know, kind of we've talked a little bit about why they went after Joma. But the narrative around it, and especially the narrative that then kind of bolstered Bolsonaro and like supported Bolsonaro, was very similar to the narratives we heard in the United States and we heard in the United Kingdom in 2016. The United Kingdom was the referendum on Brexit, or the British like leaving the EU. And it was very much this, like, we have to go back to the time before.
Yeah, it was a lot of casting that there is it's like Aaron Sorkin from American President Proved Right. How do you win elections? You talk to this group of people for longing for easier times.
Yeah, the times when things were better. And it just...
when they were simpler.
Yeah, what that means to different countries, obviously, and cultures is different. But really what a big part of it is the threat of the power structures and how those power structures are built. And in the UK, it was the threat of non-white folks. That was a huge part of like changing the demographics of the United Kingdom.
What does it mean to be British?
What does it mean to be British? In the United States, it was a lot of changing demographics. And also, the threats to the inbuilt power structure of white men, very similar to Brazil, in terms of the threats to the inbuilt power structure of the military and corruption and the white men in power mostly. But I mean, it's when they nominate Bolsonaro or something with Bolsonaro in the, he's running for election in the documentary, and it's all white Brazilians, like white men Brazilians is the entire right-wing party, which is not at all demographically representative of Brazil, and very different from what the Workers' Party looks like. So it's like, that's one of those ways in which prior to this, I was like, I don't understand. It's too complicated. I don't understand. I don't speak Portuguese. But like watching it gave me that context to be like, so this is why it looked like a global kind of wave in 2016, is because it's all perceived in a thematic way, similarly, contextually, very differently.
And for anyone wondering if there was like evangelical Christianity caught up in Brazil, the answer is yes. We're not having a separate week on religion because I wouldn't do that to Dr. Aaron, but there's a lot of parallels. And believe it or not, in Brexit as well, there's a lot of socio-religious narratives around how people in power religiously perceive the land in which they have power. Mm-hmm. And the narrative, even though America never picked a king, and so there's technically no one divinely chosen to rule us, a lot of people cling to this idea that God has ordained something to do with power in their land. And when you imbue xenophobia with supernatural leanings, it gets real dangerous. And it's also what we're seeing, even though that's not what Putin is saying. Putin has a very specific understanding of Russia's dominion that comes from a deep misinterpretation of the Russian Orthodox faith that he was raised with from some of the Russian experts that I'm reading, and I can see that completely. When you do religious imperialism with physical land, what this looks like a lot. Whether you hear the evangelical dog whistles or not, Bolsonaro's talks are full of them. Yeah. I mean, he could be watching Hillsong. I know he's not, but he could be. And it's a lot about dominionism and power, mm-hmm. and rights to land.
Yeah.
Which absolutely we see in the United States more through voting rights and gerrymandering than we do through physically moving people from their land now. We did, of course, back in the day. We are seeing in Brazil the physical movement and removal of people from their lands, the physical treatment of the rainforest, Bolsonaro's understanding of his power being enforced upon the physical land of Brazil in a way that we all need to be paying attention to, and that absolutely is the same energy that we have seen throughout any country run by white people throughout time immemorial.
Yeah. The other point I wanted to bring in was specifically contextually Brazil, which fascinated both of us, was the Brazilian legal system.
Oh my gosh, what is this nonsense?
And so we'll get into, we haven't covered President Lula yet. So, Lula was the Workers' Party leader, in case you forgot. Was elected president in 2002, and then Dilma was elected president in 2010, I think.
Yes.
And Lula was still a part of her administration, and eventually she named him chief of staff, but this was also at the time that the economy was tanking and the Operation Car Wash was exploding. And so the right-wing party took advantage of this in a way to try and get Lula out of the way. And so they charge him with being involved, and they investigate him for alleged involvement in the Petrobras scandal. And it comes down to that they claim that he owns an apartment that was paid for by one of the construction companies. And the fact that they can't prove that he owns it means that he's hiding that he owns it. So he eventually gets convicted of that, and it's held up by the Brazilian Supreme Court, and he was incarcerated. Ironically enough, while he was in the midst of a presidential campaign against Bolsonaro, and was leading in the polls, and was arrested and incarcerated. And then Bolsonaro won. So that was part of it as well. But the investigation into Lula is where we get all of this insight into the legal system and the judicial system in Brazil. So we are told, and I know Kristen joked about this at the beginning of this, it was not a joke, that Brazilians inherited their legal system from the Spanish Inquisition, in that the prosecutors are then the judges. So this man, like...
What is this nonsense?
So this man, the right-wing prosecutor judge guy, Moro,
who is now the Minister of Justice for Jair Bolsonaro, in case you were wondering.
In case you were curious what happened to him after all this went down. And he was both the investigator and then the judge of what happened.
So he was the inquisitor.
He was the inquisitor, yeah. So, like, how can you be impartial when you're the investigator, like the prosecutor, the investigator, the prosecutor, and the trial judge? You can't be. Spoiler alert.
You're not supposed to be.
You're not supposed to be. That's not how it works. So, maybe in a research break, I'll fall down a deep dive into the origins of this judicial and legal system, because it's banana pants. But that's an important point to understand the level of institutionalized corruption, right? And the legacy of colonialism, which is why we're doing the Colonizers World Tour. And, we've spent a lot of time on this video talking about the politics of Brazil, even though this is in the economy week. But you can understand when it is so institutionalized, the relationship between politicians and business people. Like, the economy is the government at this stage. Yeah. So many things are privatized. What does Anna say at the end? She goes, "We are a republic of families. Some control the media, others control the banks. They own the sand, the rock, the iron. We are a republic of families." And so it's all about keeping the family in power. It's like, The Godfather, it's like 10 Godfather families run Brazil.
Yeah, there's only 9 families that own all of the media outlets in all of Brazil.
all of it.
Like, that's like South Korea. Like, we learned that, like,
Yeah.
LG and all of those are all family-owned businesses that the South Korean government wanted to keep in power. And so they're all privately held, which I was last years old when I learned that LG was a privately held company.
So, you know, I think this is one of those things that hopefully those of you that are watching this are seeing, you know, kind of the impetus for why we want to do this Colonizers World Tour. Because if you do this kind of 2.5-hour exercise into Brazil's economy and government, you can start to make all these connections to other places in the global economy and all this stuff. And it's incredibly relevant for our lives. As we mentioned at the start, this is, we're now in the year of our Lord 2022 as we are filming this, and as it is airing originally on our YouTube. And it is another election year in Brazil. Lula was only imprisoned for, I think, a year. Ish, or I don't know, I think it was 2018 maybe he was released, so a year and a half. He is planning to run for president again in 2022, as is Jair Bolsonaro, and there's a lot of implications for the world, for the climate, for the economy, for Brazilians, what happens in this election. And so, you know, Dr. Kristen and I will be following it furiously. And you will probably hear about it in our updates as we learn more. But it's, you know, it's why we do this, because now we have one more thing to be invested in that legitimately it impacts people's lives and impacts our lives, what's going to happen in this election. So
we say that the work of empathy allows you to be less angry and less stressed. And one of the reasons that we say that is because you understand how broad the world is.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a lot harder to focus on things you can't control because you realize you can't control anything.
Yeah. And it was legitimately helpful for me to realize that, like, every country, like, you know, it's always helpful to be reminded that the United States is not an exception to almost any rule.
No.
Yeah. Because it's, you know, it's that global perspective, which is the point of the Colonizers World Tour. And as Americans, we know that Americans aren't super great at it. Our news is not super great at talking about not America. And the ethnocentrism is a real problem, we feel, and why we are doing the work that we're doing to build this empathy. So I think I don't have anything more to say about the edge of democracy that's not just ranting.
Correct. Same.
It's a crazy
I can
story,
talk about
y'all.
this conservatively for like 7 to 10 more hours, but it's all going to be the same thing over and over again.
It's such a crazy story, y'all. Just watch it.
It's a very well done documentary.
Yes.
If you're getting tired of her personal narrative at the beginning, we did too, but she brings it probably about a third of the way through. She earns that indulgence to where it's going to make sense. It's still, for me, the weakest part of the documentary, the time spent with her parents in particular, but it doesn't negate the greatness of everything else she does, and I understand why she wanted to do it.
Yeah.
I just would have, if I was her funder, would have asked her to make a different decision, that's all.
Yeah.
But it doesn't negate the greatness of her storytelling ability. Definitely can't wait to see what she does next. I hope she continues to tell stories from Brazil, and I hope Netflix continues to pick them up, because I've certainly learned a lot from her. Samesies. All right, pals. Brazil Economy Week done. There's nothing more to say about the Brazilian economy. No.
It will not come up at all next week when we talk about slavery.
Or wait. So
Or
next week
will
we're going
it?
to be talking about slavery and racism. We're going to be having a conversation about that, and then watching another piece of art that is entirely regarding that particular topic. We're going to be diving into the dichotomies and weirdnesses and idiosyncrasies, and then all the ways that they're the same as everywhere else that enslaved people. So it's going to be a time. What we want to leave you with this week is that we hope that you are somewhere that you are valued for your skill set and not your gender, and that you are somewhere that you feel you can make the progress in your life that you want to make, regardless of the systems around you. We would love it if you would do all of the YouTube-y things and give us a subscription and comment and share the stuff and do all the things so that we can invite more people into this conversation. A reminder that if you are Brazilian and you would like to have your voice on this channel, we would adore to give you the space on our channel to do that. We would love to hear from you if you've got other resources. We would love those as well. Our hope is to always start this conversation, not to have this conversation, and in its totality, and that's our gift. So if we don't see you before, we don't see you in the DMs or the comments, we'll see you next week for Slavery and Racism in Brazil. Bye.
Bye, everybody.